Hey, how's it going today, everyone? I've been meaning to talk about this opinion piece for a while now, actually for like about 2 years at this point, but I just never really got around to it. However, with the recent quote unquote gameplay of Death Stranding, I felt as though now would be the most appropriate time to actually work on this video, as opposed to just keeping it in the backlog of ideas that I have for future content. This is a subject that I sort of talked about in podcasts, but never to a great deal, so I really want to actually cover this a little bit more, add some clarification, and give some more detail on my stance with open world games and how I feel as though they should be made, if they should be made at all. So without any further delays, let's get right into it. So as I mentioned earlier, what really prompted me to make today's video as opposed to sitting on it for another 2 years was Death Stranding's new gameplay. I'm not gonna lie, when I first heard about Death Stranding, I was very optimistic given the fact that Kojima and the rest of Kojima Productions was no longer held back by publisher interference, so they could potentially deliver on some great new experiences. To an extent, I still feel that way, since there's so many different possibilities with the talent that's there. But when we start seeing people getting hyped up over walking and literal pissing mechanics, I start to question whether or not this new direction for Kojima Productions is the right one to go to. Sure, the game is an open world game and it seems like the map size is going to be the equivalent of the entirety of the US, but does that really add to the gameplay quality and the overall quality of the game, other than just having huge open spaces with what we know at least is just little to nothing to do in between? And therein lies my issues with open world games: vast open spaces with very little to do in between. And in my opinion, one of the biggest offenders of that is Ubisoft. When it comes to Ubisoft, a lot of the times what they like to say is that this is the biggest Ubisoft open world to date, to really home in the point that they made a big map because they are able to, not because it actually increases the quality of their products. A prime example of this is Tom Clancy's not really Ghost Recon Wildlands. There's this huge open map, but so very little to do. I mean, there's literally one corner of the map where there's no missions, just very few side objectives, and the only thing that's notable about that location that it's the only place on the map that features snow. Now, by comparison, look at the previous entry, Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon Future Soldier. It's not an open world game, and there's more focus on central missions with objectives at hand. Areas feel unique from one another. Generally speaking, there just isn't open space that's being wasted to make huge maps for the sake of doing that. And sure, there are open-ended levels, but for the most part, there is no wasted space. Open-ended levels, at least in Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon Future Soldier, allows you to take multiple routes to get to your destination. But again, at its core, it is a linear experience. Taking the focus back onto Kojima Productions, Metal Gear Solid is another really good example of a franchise being objectively better as a linear experience compared to being an open world experience. When it comes to MGS5 The Phantom Pain, the experience is a mixed bag, much like Wildlands, because it has a big open world with very little to do. And in MGS5's case, I would also go a step further and say that there's very little threat to the actual player. By comparison to pretty much all previous entries in the franchise, we lose a lot of great pacing, well-structured areas that make you think about your every action, and I'll even go as far as to say, at least in the case of Ground Zeroes, that was, in my opinion, a much more ideal approach to a bit of an idea that I had in mind, or rather a term that I had in mind.
So this idea or term that I've had in mind for the last 2 years is something that I like to refer to as open linearity. The idea is for a game to have this approach in mind, it needs to be a linear game with open world aspects. So like in the case of MGS5 Ground Zeroes, you have Camp Omega, and all of the missions are featured there, and they allow you, the player, to approach these missions how you see fit within the small confines of the base. For example, let's just ignore the side missions and just focus on the main one, which shares the same name as the title, Ground Zeroes. There's one main objective and two side objectives in Ground Zeroes. Your main objective is to rescue Paz and Chico, while the side objective is to extract any POWs you come across one of which can give you some information that would help you get to pause while avoiding detection. What I didn't know my first time playing was that rescuing one character over the other can change the results to some degree. Extracting pause first prevents the sequence of the guards going on high alert to try to find her. In the case of Chico, if you extract the POWs near him, the cutscene that plays when you enter his cage is slightly altered. You might be wondering though, how does this have anything to do with my takes on open world games? Well, the point that I'm trying to get across is that the significantly smaller map size with the various objectives gives the player a sense of potential variety in how they can complete those objectives. Essentially, a game can be linear while still providing open areas for them to explore and make small decisions that can make a huge impact on the experience. Although I don't think that it necessarily needs to have a major impact in every single case or instance, but it's the general idea of it that makes it sound like, to me, a better way to do things as opposed to just making a large open map with lots of things spread out but nothing really in between those things that you need to get to. Perhaps you could take something like the Yakuza franchise, for example, where there's small city spaces with lots of side content to give you a break from the main content. At least in that regard, doing something like that makes more sense because it's crammed into a small space, giving players the illusion that there's lots to do or lots to explore. Or another great example of this would be The Evil Within 2, where there's a small town with open segments, and even though the game is a linear experience, it encourages you to explore it. There's risks to venturing out into the unknown, but it's worthwhile for the reward. This is something that I feel as though open world games seem to lack heavily. So to answer the question of the video's title, ideally I think it would be better to stick to a well-designed linear experience, one that could perhaps still cater to open world experiences without alienating those like myself who are fatigued by seeing open world games with this design philosophy of trying to make a giant map because we can. It's not so much that these games shouldn't be made, but open world games, in my opinion, need to be taken down several notches. Sure, making a large-scale open world game is an impressive technical feat, but if it's at the cost of solid gameplay along with how fun the overall product is, then is it really worth it? Anyway, that's all I really had to talk about for today, though I am curious to know what you all think of today's subject down in the comment section below. Do you share the same or similar views that I have expressed within the video today, or do you think that open world games are fine as they are? If you're new to the channel, feel free to comment, like, and maybe even share the video. Also consider subscribing, and with that, I will be seeing you on the next one. Hopefully I will be recovered from my cold, which is why there was a sudden shift in how my voice sounds, so I do apologize about that, but I do want to get this video out as soon as possible. But with that all being said, like I said, I will see you on the next one. Matane.